Farm-based first here?
We're live.
We are live. Okay, welcome back.
Abby, do you have a presentation?
We do. It should be on the
It is.
DevFo website.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe I missed this.
Yes.
And this is one's up.
The one sheet is Jake's from the.
It's Jake's.
Oh, and
No, you have to go in the,
I got to refresh.
Okay, got it.
no, you have to go into the meeting rather than just the.
No, I needed to refresh my screen.
Under supporting documents. Great.
Okay.
So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'll be walking you through a renter credit overview, and I will briefly lay out what the prior law was, but really the focus is on what is in current law. The reason why I do want to point out some of the structural aspects of the prior law is this is very new. It was Act 160 of 2020 that made the change, but as Senator Cummings has mentioned, it didn't actually affect renters until this year. That was the first filing year.
I think we asked to delay implementation because the tax department was busy doing things with COVID.
The first year of COVID, it was introduced in 2020, I think February, or maybe the very last day of
I think it was
discussions
one of
and
the last things we did.
on this, and then everyone went remote. So it actually passed in October of 2020.
Okay.
So the second page of the presentation lays out the outline, what I'll go over. So what is the renter credit? Because I do want to distinguish between the tax credit and the renter credit. Then I'll go into detail as to how the credit actually functions, and that's the majority of the presentation. So moving on to page 4, what is the renter credit? So this is a cash assistance program for eligible Vermont residents whose income is at or below the program thresholds. I did want to point out, again, this is separate and different from the homestead property tax credit. It's also slightly a different animal from other benefit programs. For example, it is administered by the Department of Taxes. That's more of the history of how it came to be. It was enacted along with the homestead property tax credit. It was enacted in Act 60. It has grown into something very different from the property tax credit. Also of note, because many of you did work on the child tax credit and are familiar with some of the recent concerns about receiving monthly payments and how that impacts federal benefits. This credit is paid in one lump sum, so you don't run into those benefit determination issues with cliffs and other concerns. And I just wanted to highlight that if you are considering any, as that's part of the committee's charge, is any potential changes to the credit and other considerations for creating a new credit if you decided to do that. Moving on to page 5, the prior law. In statute, it is now called the renter credit. Renter rebate is still a similar program, but it was significantly changed. The renter credit was based on the household income definition. That is retained in statute and still applies to the property tax credit. But the renter credit now has its own specific income definition, which we'll talk about later on. As you remember, household income is quite complex, and the renter credit definition is more simplified, at least for the filers. Under prior law, the renter rebate was capped at that $47,000 income threshold, which has been in statute since Act 60. Again, you'll recognize that from the circuit breaker. So it was the same income level. The way that the credit or the rebate was calculated was that it was only available if a certain percentage of the rent paid exceeded a percentage of the renter's household income. Only one claimant per household could claim the renter rebate in the same way that the property tax credit is still structured. Again, it was not adjusted for family size, did not take into account the number of individuals. However, everyone living in the household had to declare their income. It required in order for a renter to be eligible, they had to rent for the full calendar year for 12 months. There were different landlord certificate requirements, and I won't go through those in great detail until we look at how it changed under the maximum was $3,000. So Act 160 of 2020, it did pass at the end of October in 2020, and it changed the name to renter credit. Again, there were some discussions at the time, there were discussions in the prior year in 2019 when homestead property tax income sensitivity adjustment was changed to credit. So this does align with that. And again, there were discussions about how this might impact federal benefit determinations. So this lines up those two types of credits. The new credit calculation for the renter credit is now based on federal housing data and federal income limits. And those are both adjusted for the family size, the number of individuals in a tax filing group or unit, and the renter's location in the state. And what's interesting about the way this is structured is it gets into the detail of who's living in the household and whether they're unrelated individuals living in the household as well. It adjusts the credit. It has a lot of different levers and adjusts for different household situations.
Which caused issues when you had 3 roommates and one had a job that made a lot of money and put them over the credit limit and the other 2 didn't, or one had more money, and how it got divided up. And used to get a lot of emails about those issues.
Yes, and again, the household income definition was also complex and was a very lengthy form.
Yeah, I do remember getting a call from my daughter one afternoon saying she just spent all day filling out tax renter rebate, and only to find out she wasn't eligible and she wasn't happy. And getting landlords to sign off was also difficult.
And that was changed. That's perfect. That leads into line 7, where the new definition of income was one of the ways that it made filing easier for renters was that it took what's on the federal form 1040, it's currently the line 9, it's total income. So it points right, it's a long definition in statute, but it gets right out of line on the personal income tax form. So it's easier for taxpayers to identify what is the income that I have to report to Vermont.
What do we do with the folks that don't file income tax? Because we found out there was a fairly large number of those. They just aren't, they're just out. If you want this, you have to file.
Are you speaking about the renter credit or because that did come up with the child tax credit?
Yeah, no, they came up in this committee discussion, the number of folks.
Their AGI was at a certain level and
Yeah.
they're not filing.
The
They were
community
not-
action agencies do and a few other
Yeah,
advocacy
I
groups do
know
a
they do.
significant amount of work getting people to file who would benefit from filing.
Okay,
Don't want to put Jake on the spot, but I think that's maybe more of an administrative.
yeah, well,
If Jake knows or I can follow.
okay. I'm just throwing it out there. We don't have to have an answer right now.
Yes. I was pointing to the 1040 just in terms of how that was defined was a lot of work around making it as specific to a particular line, which is not typically how a statute is written to meet the form. The form meets statute, but intent was for to simplify the process for taxpayers, for renters, sorry.
Senator. Abby, so the landlord no longer has to give the certificate to the tenant. It used to be that the renter had to go say, send me it, and then they sent it together with their application. Now they just say, hey, I'm filing for this. Or all landlords need to do it regardless if their tenant asks.
Yes, so there was a number of units requirement. If a landlord had 2 or more, they were required to send it to the Department of Taxes. Now it's all units, all landlords have to send the landlord certificate. And if renters were not, say they were living in just one accessory dwelling, maybe their landlord lives next door, the landlord was not required to give it unless the renter requested it. So yes, it would create issues where a renter couldn't get the certificate. There was specific language in statute saying not having the certificate would not disqualify a renter, but it, I think, administratively created issues, especially if the renter didn't know their span or other, sort of bureaucratic concerns.
So even if the landlord is renting out a ski chalet for part of their money, they still have, for year round, not
Okay,
short term.
not a short
Year
term.
round, but like, obviously these people are not qualifying for the credit. They still have to fill out.
Still have to report. That's correct. And I did already mention this, but it was effective the beginning of 2021, but that didn't affect filers until the start of this year because they were filing in 2022 for last year's rent. On slide 8, I laid out what parts of the structure have not changed from the renter rebate to the renter credit. So the funding is still from the general fund. That has been the case since 2018. So the renter credit does not have an impact on the education fund. And I did just check this last budget, had a line item for the renter credit from the general fund, and it was 9.5 million.
Okay.
Like the renter rebate, the renter credit requires domicile in Vermont for the entire taxable year, and it does not allow dependents to claim the credit. So that gets at the student population that's being claimed on their parents or someone else's tax form. As I will mention later, it doesn't have to be an entire taxable year of renting any longer. Previously, you had to rent for 12 months. Now it's, I think it's 6. Yes. And
Okay.
it doesn't have to be consecutive.
So right now, if you have a student who's 19 years old, he's being claimed as a dependent by his parents who live in New York, but that student works all summer and earns $20,000. He's going to pay an income tax here, right? But he won't be eligible for the renter credit.
That's correct. If the individual who is renting is claimed as a dependent on another individual's
Person.
tax return, they are not eligible. But they would be paying. They would have a filing requirement here if they're earning Vermont income.
Okay.
So the information that's on a landlord certificate has not changed. That wasn't amended. Some of the penalties were amended because there is no longer the requirement to send a certificate to a renter, and who the renter or who the landlord has to send the certificate to has changed. Still, the time for claiming the credit is when tax return. So it is linked to the income tax return form. So without confirming, but just assuming logically, individuals do have to file an income tax return to claim this. In terms of getting into the details, moving on to slide 10. This is where it does get more in the weeds. We had done, I think either the first meeting or one of the very first meetings, we looked at different definitions of income, and we did look at household income in detail. The renter credit is different from that. Household income that is still used for the property tax credit starts with federal AGI, then it has a long list of additions and subtractions. And it's intended to show what income is available to a household to pay property taxes. It doesn't account for the number of people in the household, and everyone has to declare their income if they're living in the same household. Also to note, if there was sort of a transient population living in a household, someone lived there maybe as for a couple of months and left, their income is still required to be reported, which also creates issues with compliance. And I think that was a big
You got to find the roommate that moved to California, and he's not about to tell you what his income was.
Right, exactly. And again, there was the prior household income threshold at 47,000, the same as the circuit breaker. And it was only for rent that exceeded a percentage of income. So the new eligibility requirements, if you are taking it from a 1040, it's line 9, it's total income. And the way that that's calculated is starting with federal adjusted gross income and then adding back what's been carved out by AGI. So similar to the household income definition, there are certain trade or business losses, exempt interest, only 75% of exempt Social Security benefits. So that did allow 25% of Social Security benefits to be excluded. And then there is sort of a long list of other adjustments which are in the household income definition. Oh, I did want to point out, because this was, some of you worked on the exclusion for household members last session that did pass for asylees, refugees, certain humanitarian parolees. There is a list of individuals who are excluded from household income under the property tax credit. That is no longer really relevant to the renter credit, but that is, another discussion that happened last session. On slide 12, this does lay out how the months of renting was changed. Previously, a renter had to be renting for the full calendar year. Now it's at least 6 months, and then the rent is prorated if it's 6 months or more, but less than 12 months, but more than 6 months. Again, it's not required to be consecutive, so an individual could live part of the year in one place, maybe leave the state, but come back, still have an intent to be domiciled during the entire taxable year, or perhaps living with someone and not renting. They would still be eligible as long as 6 months are rented. There are also provisions for business use. So if 25% of a dwelling's floor space is used for business purposes, the credit's prorated by any portion that's used for business. That's the same as existing statute for the homestead property. Again, one of the biggest shifts for the renter credit from the renter rebate was that if more than one renter is in the household, each of them individually may be eligible. Again, they have to be domiciled in Vermont all year, and they cannot be a dependent of another taxpayer. And if there are more, so it could be perhaps a family, maybe a family of 3, and then a roommate, those would be considered 2 tax filing groups. Each of their credits would be reduced in half. So there is a provision to recognize that there is more income in that household, but if they're living with unrelated individuals, their credit is reduced.
Okay, domiciled in Vermont, does that mean you have to live in Vermont, but not necessarily in the same rental unit for a whole year?
And perhaps not even physically present for the entire year. That's an existing definition. It's used for homestead as well. So it looks at intent.
We got the military overseas, and then there's people that get sent overseas for a year for their business. We had a few emails on that.
So it could be, yes, in that case, they could be gone for the entire year, but they would still be considered.
This is their legal residence.
If the intent is to return, then it is their domicile. There's also a physical presence test where it's 6 months, or at least 180, I think that's 182 days. Is the same for income tax as well, as long as you meet one of those tests. As we did just discuss, so slide 14, the landlord certificate is no longer required for renters. It does have the Department of Taxes. This also provides all of that information that's required by statute, including the number of units, the address of the landlord, the span. Previously, it was only when a landlord had a property with 2 or more units. So now all landlords report to the Department of Taxes. Getting into how the renter credit is actually calculated, the changes in Act 160, and this is getting onto slide 15, really changed and moved away from looking at rent and what part of rent is a proxy for property taxes. That construct was completely done away with. So now the renter credit looks at fair market rent, which is set by the US Housing and Urban Development Department. They set it, they provide all of that information publicly. I've provided the link actually to the website where you can look at different statistical areas. So it looks at locations, very specific locations that more or less correspond to counties. And it sets the rent for households based on the number of individuals in the household as well. So the renter credit no longer looks at what an individual is actually paying in rent. It's all based on fair market rent. One thing that I've noted in both fair market rent and then the different thresholds for income is that when looking at the data during the discussions leading up to Act 60 being enacted was that Franklin and Grand Isle County were included in the greater Burlington area. So those were specifically split out, and instead of having it's the Burlington, South Burlington Metropolitan Statistical Area that's defined by the US HUD, Franklin or Grand Isle County now is subject to the average statewide fair market rent and income thresholds. So that was just because looking at different costs in different areas. So again, by using fair market rent, this means that household members and the number of individuals in a household is taken into account. And the way that's done, at least statutorily, is linking an individual's personal exemptions claimed. So again, I'm sorry, I couldn't have answered that before, but now I'm realizing as I'm walking through this, definitely an individual would have to have filed an income tax return in Vermont because the size of the household for fair market rent is based on the number of personal exemptions that are claimed. So if you have a spouse and a child, you would be considered a 3-person household for determining your fair market rent. And then again, if there were, say, 2 renters or 1 renter and then a roommate, the credit would be reduced in half for each of those individuals. There are some, so sorry, I'm breezing through these. On slide 17, the actual rent is no longer taken into account. There are some exceptions that I'll talk about in a few slides, but for most renters, the credit is either 10% of that fair market rent. So it's fair market rent that's sensitive to household size, or it phases out depending on the renter's income. So the phase out is based on 2 US HUD definitions. One is extremely low income and one is very low income. And in between the extremely low and the very low, it phases out. And then when you hit very low, you're no longer eligible for the credit. And again, there is an exception for Franklin or Grand Isle counties. They get the average income limits for the state because they were treated differently from what the policy decision behind that was to pull them out from the Burlington area rents, which were higher. And I provided some examples in slide 18 of what the US HUD has set for 2022 for income limits. So an example for a 1-person household in the Burlington, South Burlington area, extremely low income limit is about 22,550, and then very low income is a little more than 10,000 more than that. And the average, so this would apply to Franklin, Grand Isle counties, is 32,500. A bit of an idea of how it's sensitized and what income groups are eligible for this. So in the example of a 1-person household in the Burlington, South Burlington area, if an individual has $37,601, they would not be eligible for a credit. Slide 19 uses a lot more words to describe the phase out. I don't know if there are any other questions there. It just gets, the credit amount gets progressively smaller, and then when you pass the very low income limit, you're not eligible.
Okay.
There are a couple of special circumstances, moving on to slide 20. And this is the last slide. It was recognized that there are renters who receive a rental subsidy, could be federal, could be state. Rather than automatically excluding those individuals, the credit is just 10% of actual rent paid, so it wouldn't, those are individuals who are already receiving a rental subsidy and there is a need there. The policy decision was to give them the 10% credit. And it's actually, that's the special circumstance where it is actual rent paid. Although just do want to point out under statute that is net any utilities, or it's really it's only the rent. If anything else is included in that, it's only the rent that the credit is based on. Also, this was in statute already, so this was retained for individuals who rent mobile home lots. And I will put a note that maybe in our technical corrections bill, we should change that to manufactured homes. But current statute still reads mobile home lots. When an individual rents a lot, that also is still subject to the old calculation. It uses actual rent paid. Those are a couple of little technical examples. And lastly, it is important to note that the maximum credit was reduced by $500. So it previously was $3,000. Now it's $2,500. And that is everything I'd prepared. That pretty much ran you through the whole chapter that relates to.
Whole big chapter.
There were a lot of policy discussions and decisions made that you can see. These are
So if we go to an
well thought out.
income tax structure, the question is, does this credit make up for the income tax that you're going to have to pay?
No, I don't think so.
And this is very limited to lower income people.
Well, what I think is interesting about it is I don't think anything, if we did implement a full income-based education tax, I don't think anything in here, I think they're compatible, actually, is the sentence, because of the changes that were made and that it's sort of separated from tax, sort of assumption of taxes paid, and this is really more of a rental subsidy at this point.
That is absolutely one option. I'm just trying to find my statutory charge. I think it just says if you wish to change it, if you wanted to make any changes, how would you address renters? So one option would be to retain the existing credit. In S212, that was retained, for example. Not that that's necessarily something I want to follow, but
I suppose,
there is precedent.
depending on the income level, you could say, well, paying rent is, how is it that different than paying a mortgage? I mean, we don't exempt you from paying your income tax because you're paying a mortgage on, at least with this ed thing, or do we? You do have a mortgage deduction.
We do and don't have
Interest deduction,
No, we don't.
Mortgage.
if you itemize.
Okay,
You're over 24,000, right? Yeah.
okay.
Can I ask a question
Yeah.
on the utility part of the, is it only if the utilities are named as part of it? Aren't there circumstances where, like, here's your rent, each just happens to be included, they don't know how much of that is utilities and how much is space rent? I assume they don't try to figure that out.
Yeah, the statutory definition is gross rent, so allocable rent is a percentage, 21% of gross rent, and that means the rent actually paid during the taxable year for the right of occupancy. So I don't know how that would be administered, but it has been, just trying not to look at Jake and put him on the spot, but
Water, because especially when you're renting houses, if they weren't built to be apartments, you get,
Right. it's hard
there's
to-
one water meter.
Right.
Some of them divide them out.
One of those things.
Any really smart landlord has been getting out of paying the heat for some time. And making that's the big one that gets put out.
I'll use Emily's technique of making an assumption and having it get corrected. So this to me, this was very helpful for me because I'm quite unfamiliar with it. really just seems really separate. And if we're going with option two, which we seem to be doing, this really seems very separate and apart since their rent still theoretically includes property taxes for education through the non-homestead property tax.
Yeah.
And this gives some rebate or payment to a group of renters, but not all renters.
And then even though I changed it to credit, it's still a rebate. Like they get a cash, they get a
Yeah.
check, right? It's not a credit.
It's not a tax rebate, but it's a.
Right,
It's not a tax credit. It
payment.
doesn't function like a typical tax credit.
Okay. Any other questions for Abby?
Can you remind me one more time how much money out of the general fund this is? On the-
9.5, this.
Yeah, I thought I wrote it down and now I don't see it anymore. Thank
And
you.
how, do you know the number of claimants?
That's,
Not now, that would be.
I imagine that's gonna come in a moment.
I think so, Jake's got.
I would
I
tell-
wondered if I couldn't see
I
it.
wonder how long this will stay in the general fund.
2018.
Forever.
Forever, right.
Yeah.
Just like pensions.
Thank you, Abby.
Which is part of, the general fund had to hold the ed fund harmless, so they transferred things over as
Yeah, that
well.
was all that grand bargain of 2018. Got rid of it.
Jake, come on up.
We did well.
This place is too big.
They had a lot of people. They were doing redistricting in here.
Okay, yeah, redistricting takes a lot of people.
And
Still,
pensions. They did pensions and redistricting in here.
you've got, I feel like Jake is in another world down there.
Very far away.
Yeah. It's the separate table we've got so that the screen is up between the two, which usually you're far away, but it's even farther.
I prefer Ways and Means, honestly.
Those three, yeah.
Yeah. The old committee rooms, we,
Jake Feldman, Tax Department. And would you like me to start with leftover questions from just now or?
I have a leftover question from this morning.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Sure.
Does that work for you agenda wise?
yeah, it's on topic.
It's on topic. I realized yesterday that at some point in the spring, I had been assuming that the report that we were asking of you all to do related to this topic would include you matching up the data sets between income and household income, between HAI and household income for your report. Did you do that?
Definitely.
Okay. And
But
so you've like lined up those two data sets?
yes,
Okay.
but I need,
Julia have it?
yes. Do you want to sort it out later or should I describe it?
I'd love if you described it and then we can sort after description. Let's sort later, but just,
Yeah. There's a data set that tax prepares for JFO just about every year that has all the homesteads. So not everybody, just all the homesteads. And then it pulls in the AGIs of the people in the homesteads. And so that data set exists. There isn't a grand data set of all the income filers, you know, the 340,000 resident income filers with the 170,000 homesteads where you could see the people who aren't homesteads. So JFO has the same microsimulation model where they can run income tax stuff on that entire group. But there's no combined one of those.
and you didn't create a combined one of those as part of this study this summer?
No.
Okay.
So, and the question was, there were like 4 charges for us, and it said like an education income tax. And we had to think about like, what is an education income tax?
Yeah.
We had no idea.
Yeah.
So we were basing it off of S212, which was an education income tax only on homesteads. So for that, we had the data set built, ready to go.
Okay.
But what I was telling Julia before we started is that we could try, because they were trying to quantify the people who are resident income tax filers but aren't homesteads. It's difficult to do. So what I was saying to Julia is what we could do is try to flag of all the income tax filers, flag who is represented on a homestead, and then give them some data on anyone who isn't. And then, so that could help with their questions. It was very wonky, more wonky than I usually talking about merging data sets. But that's the idea, is that we could help them identify who's not a homestead but does file a resident income tax return.
Okay, cool.
So that would be like renters,
Yes.
a lot of renters,
Yes.
mostly, and then maybe some students and some other groups would be in there.
How about domestic partners filing separately, only one's name is on the deed?
That should be represented in the homestead file, because even if they're filing separately, they should be listing both social security numbers, and then the income should be merged in.
Okay.
Not to say that everybody does it perfectly, but that should be all there.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right.
Those are all my questions from the morning.
That's how well it's gone this morning.
Presentation.
Either that or we are really overwhelmed. Our brains have shut down. So you've got us more.
Yes, but it's the front page is like very much things that Abby talked about. I think maybe I could color it a little bit by talking about why.
Okay. And you've done this for 1 year now, and it went well?
It went pretty well. I would say for the first year of such a big change, it was pretty good.
Considering everything that's gone on for renters and subsidies and,
Yeah, there's been a lot of subsidies paid to renters over the last couple of years because of the pandemic, and that actually counts as a subsidy. Our general counsel determined, so that made it so like there's sort of more complicated situations than we were anticipating. But I think that assistance is phasing out a little bit now. So hopefully things will get easier. But on the question of why the tax department proposed a renter credit reform, the tax department has always struggled to process renter credit claims. It was something like for every dollar, for the statistics, 2/3 of them were erroring, which is extremely high for us. And we were spending like 37 cents for every dollar we were sending out, doing the work to process them. So it was very challenging. And on the other side, we were hearing from renters and advocates that it was very challenging for them too. So what we did is we looked at a great study done by the Housing Council in 2015 that made a bunch of really good recommendations on how to reform it. And we did those as best as we could. So that's where it came from. It wasn't, sort of our imagination. It was in as much as we could, we followed that Housing Council study. The first year was tax year 21. So yes, in the spring of 2022 is when we first processed these new claims. I have this side by side that has been helpful for people who are trying to understand what changed. It used to be that you could only make one claim per household, and this is a problem because if you're living with roommates, you have to ask them for their social security numbers and all these very sensitive details of their income. There's something wrong about that. And then on the other end, if you get the rebate and you're sitting on that cash, you know, how does the roommate get theirs? So that was not ideal. And the legislature had been asking us for years how to fix that. So now you can, filers who are not in the same unit, so they're not married, can file separate claims, but their credit is scaled down because they're living with another income earning person. You have to be domiciled in Vermont the full year. You can't be somebody else's dependent. The part year renters is to try to help people who might be experiencing temporary homelessness, or if you rent 9 months out of the year, but maybe 3 months out of the summer, you're working at a state park and not renting, you should still get the credit. So now you only have to be renting for half the year or more. We do adjust it based on the number of months you're renting, but so that has changed. The renter rebate, like property tax credits used to have no sensitivity to household size. Now it does. The credit amounts are sensitive to household size and income limits, which is very common among housing subsidies. So if you're a 2-person household, you get a credit based on a 2-bedroom apartment. What you're actually doing in the apartment, whether you share it with, you know, it's just a 1-bedroom apartment, or if you have a kid who sleeps in your bed or a kid who has their own bedroom, it doesn't matter. If you're a 2-person household, it's based on a 2-bedroom apartment. If you're 3, it's based on a 3-bedroom apartment, fair market rent. And then same with the income, like if you have a bigger family, there's an assumption that you have less disposable income. So the income thresholds are further out the bigger your family is. And Abby did a great job with that. In Vermont, there's quite a discrepancy county to county on what rents are. I mean, obviously Chittenden County is higher, and under the renter rebate, you know, there was no sensitivity to that. The new credit there is both the income limits and the fair market rents that determine credits are reflective of the county you live in. There used to be 3 forms. You had to fill out a renter rebate form, you had to fill out a 2-page household income form, and then you had to get a landlord certificate from your landlord. Now there are 2 forms, but you only do one of them. You do a renter credit form, it should say. The income section of that is 5 lines long instead of 27 lines of household income. And then your landlord doesn't give you the certificate, they send it to the department. On the issue of landlord certificates, it used to be that it was individualized. A landlord gave one to each renter. Now it's by property. So if a landlord owns a house with 5 apartments in it, they give us one certificate. And on that certificate, they tell us a few details about the property, and then they list the renters. And they don't have to go do the calculation for allocable rent because it's not dependent on allocable rent anymore. They just list the renters' names so that we can verify. The income limits, as Senator Cummings is well aware, it's this hard $47,000 that has not changed in 25 years, same as the circuit breaker. That's what the renter rebate income limit used to be. Now it's the HUD very low income metric, which is like 50% of the area median, I think, by family size. That's the limit for eligibility. The income definition used to be same as household income, which is like Vermont's modified AGI, and now it's quite a bit simpler. It's like basically pulling 4 lines from the 1040. There was a question before about non-filers. What do they do if they don't have a 1040? And the credit system was designed so if your income is so low that you don't need to file a federal return, that you just get a full credit anyway. So they had nothing to fill out in the income section. We've had to modify that a little bit because it doesn't quite work for people who get Social Security. So they have some special instructions, but for the most part, that's the way it works. there used to be 3 cliffs in the system. The percentages of income changed drastically at 10,000, 25,000, and then it ended at 47,000. And now it's using algebra to phase it out from the HUD extremely low income to the HUD very low income levels.
Did you just say using algebra?
Yeah.
So the next time your high school kids say, I don't know why I have to take algebra, so you can get a renter's credit.
Well, they can still get the credit even if they don't know.
Just need algebra.
Don't tell them
The
that.
tax department.
That's right.
It helps.
Form does it for you.
The old system was not adjusted for inflation. Naturally, people's rents did go up with inflation, as did their incomes. But now it's kind of this moving window. The rent amounts are advanced each year and the income limits also move out each year. The maximum credit used to be 3,000, it's now 2,500. Subsidized renters are treated similarly. The landlord used to have to back out the subsidy, they still do. But now what happens is the landlord backs out the subsidy to find their, like, basically their net rent after subsidy and any utilities, and then the renter gets a 10%, the subsidized renter gets 10% of that.
What is the subsidized renter?
Section 8, is that?
Section 8.
Yeah.
Or a housing trust property?
Pardon?
Or a housing trust property as well?
Because they're charging below market or something.
Yeah. Does that count?
Not sure. Yeah, I have to.
There's a whole lot, I mean, I don't know how we figure it, but most of the low income apartments we build, the people can't afford to pay the rent to cover the overhead, never mind the construction costs. So that's been perpetually subsidized housing, but it's not but then the owner is the housing program. It's not the same. Section 8 is money that is paid directly to a landlord. I think this subsidy is, and we're subsidizing downstreet housing.
Well, and sometimes there are also Section 8 properties where it's a housing,
Yes.
where it's federal housing.
I think it might just be Section 8, but I would have to go look.
Okay, thank you.
It used to be that the renter would calculate the credit on their own form, but now they give us the information and we calculate it, which is more like the way property tax credits work. The credit calculation used to be 21% of contract rent. And then you'd take the relevant percentage of their income multiplied by their income. And if the rent was more than the amount based on income, then that's the credit, the rebate. And now it's the full credit amount is 10% of the HUD fair market rent for your family size in your county you live in. And then it gets phased out. If you're between the extremely low income limit and the very low income limit. The next line is a little bit mathy. I walk through and with a child in Washington County who makes $30,000 of income and was paying $10,000 in contract rents after subsidies. And I'm similar. But if you kind of think of this like 1,000 foot, you might be able to anticipate who would be affected by it, which is on the back. Basically, the amount distributed is similar, and it's shifted where the money goes. One person, smaller households, it shifted basically from one person households out towards larger households. And I should say it's not really well, it is households in a way, but it's more like family size. And it also shifted it somewhat from higher incomes towards lower incomes in a way, relatively higher incomes. That's what that top table is showing. It's the change in the average renter rebate, now called renter credit, by household size and household income. And you can kind of see like a one-person household who had income over 400,000, the average change was $450 decrease. And then if you're wondering how many of those households there are, that's what that table right below it is. And for example, that group that I just talked about that had a $450 decrease on average, there's 700 of those.
So 16,500 total. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And there was another question from a few minutes ago about how many individual claimants are getting the credit now. And it ended up being closer to like 12,000. That we had this assumption that there would be sort of more uptake, which we were hoping for, more program utilization, but I'm not sure if that's come to pass yet. It might happen as time goes on, but.
Well, there's been all kinds of renter,
Right, other support.
other things out there with the COVID money, so. Because that was the thought, that because it was so difficult and the landlord wouldn't get around and your landlord wasn't local and yeah, the whole deal, that we would see a big uptake. So it'll be interesting to see as the other programs phase out, if this one gets more interest.
Did you just say 12,000 people, claimants?
There were about 12,000 credit recipients, I believe.
And then 16,530 claimants?
This was an estimated number.
Yeah, there were, so, and it's like some people who used to get a rebate would no longer get one under the credit. And some people, this is complicated, but in the data set that we were using to model this, there were people who claimed it and we had their information and we knew that they would get a credit under the new system. Like maybe their income was 48,000 and they had like 5 kids or something. So it's kind of like a bigger pool. And the benefit also went from households with higher rents more towards households with lower rents. So in the next table down, you can kind of see that some of the bigger losers are in households where rent is like $1,500 or more a month. And that's because now it's based on fair market rent, and that, is probably over the fair market rent. And then again, if you're interested in how many households fall in those groupings, that's the table below it. And you can kind of see that there aren't as many households with the high rents as there are lower rents.
Excuse me.
So some of these numbers will change as rental rates, everything we're hearing about people being evicted and rates being raised, and that we'll see some change in these numbers next year.
How is the HUD, how is it adjusted?
HUD does some resurveying every year. And Vermont, Section 8 uses these numbers too. But I don't know exactly how they do their surveying, but I know that the fair market rents grow each year. Last year, there was a good amount of growth in them. But yeah, rents are going up for sure with the shortage of housing.
The decision to focus more on lower income folks who are paying less in rent. This might be more a question, I don't know, you and your memory of the policy conversations, or Scott, why?
Why did we focus, is your question?
I understand why you might want to focus on lower income folks. I guess I'm confused about the focus on folks who pay less in rent.
No, I don't know if,
I could see why, because if.
just a higher
rent is
percent of their
lower,
income, I think.
Or if this, the rent is above market, then you want to be subsidizing that. Like, are they renting a place that's,
Fancier than they deserve.
yeah, well, obviously when.
I mean,
Yeah.
their rent might,
Or they're like, the landlord might be increasing the rent because they know they're getting the subsidy or something above the market.
I think we were just trying to be more sensitive to people whose rent was a higher percentage of their income. And I think, Jake, you were part of that conversation. I think that's what we're trying to be sensitive to, if I remember correctly.
I can remember the conversation in my committee, and it again was somebody that was renting a really nice condo.
Yeah, we didn't want to help that
And
situation, right?
But that was, when we did this, was before we really hit the wall with housing shortages.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
And only the really nice condo might be available right now.
Yeah.
It's either that or the back of your
Those
car.
HUD numbers should, you know.
Let us know,
fluctuate.
yeah, but that'd be something to kind of flag and watch is
Yeah.
the impact. And of course, the bottom could drop out of this and probably will anytime soon. I mean, housing markets do that with fair regularity. And
Yeah.
I'm assuming that HUD has more resources than we do to track it. Okay.
You can still rent a nice place. It just can't be above the market, HUD market rate.
Well, and you can still rent it, you just.
You can rent it.
Right, I mean,
Yeah.
you would not get as much as you used to.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. Questions for Jake?
If, after doing this for a year, are there ways you would improve it?
Pardon?
After doing this for a year, are there ways you would improve it, like clean up details, things like that?
I'm trying to separate like my own personal instincts here versus like sort of administrative type things. Yeah, I think all the ways that I improve it are kind of more of my like own personal feelings. So I could offer that that the appropriation from the general fund is 9.5 million, and it has been for the past several years. And what we saw at the end of renter rebate is that we were distributing less than that. And then we were hoping with renter credit that it would perk back up, but it has not perked back up enough. So, I think this is tending more towards personal, but I think if the appropriation is 9.5, that we should do our best to target that endpoint. There's been these mitigating factors the past couple of years with all this pandemic assistance, and it's very difficult to see how that's affecting the renter credit. But hopefully when that quiets down, we'll be able to fine tune the credit a little bit more to spend what's appropriated.
Scott?
Logistical question, Jake. So if we did option 2, which is or education income tax, just full vote, and if we decided that we wanted to make make renters so that they could get the education income tax they paid in.
The non-homestead, you want to give them the
Renters.
income tax back?
Yes. Okay, so that's, but I also, the more forms you make them make people fill out, the less likely they are, or more likely they are just throw their hands up. And could that kind of a construct, do you think it could be melded into the existing renter credit just to make it one form seamless with that? From just from an implementation standpoint?
The renter credit format would be closer to being possible to leverage, give them back some property taxes that they pay. But you want to give them the income taxes that they pay back?
If we just made that decision to say, we said, we collected, let's say 1% of their Vermont AGI is education income tax, but they're a renter, and then we want to, rebate them or get it back to them. Could it be done using this existing form, modifying it to include that information, and just trying to avoid having to have people fill out multiple forms, and then they just stop filling out forms.
Could it be this plus an income tax credit?
Well, the income, if they're paying 1% of their AGI, you just want to give them 1% of their AGI right back, right?
Right.
So, yeah, you could, could you put it on the same form?
Yes, that's what I'm asking.
Not sort of, but the renter credit only applies to low income renters.
Right.
And which is, let's see, maybe about a sixth of all the renting households in Vermont. So you'd have to set something up so that every renting household was filling out some form to give them back their income tax that they paid. If I'm following.
And do we want to give them back all of their income tax because they aren't paying all the property taxes? If you live in a 5-apartment building, you're paying a fifth. Maybe if your landlord is that efficient and is actually figuring it, but I think you said it's based on the market, what you can get, not necessarily on your bills, and some landlords go up 1% a year rather than wait 5 years and go up 5%.
And we're assuming that rent correlates to property value too, which
No.
it doesn't.
So I think the issue that we're struggling with, Jake, is even with this, assume that renters are paying part of the property tax in their rent, and therefore they should get a rebate because if they're a certain income, because we give a rebate for property tax in an income. We're now going to, the discussion is, we're looking at going to a income tax. I don't know if we're calling it a surcharge or a separate income tax, but we're going to an income tax to pay for local education. Renters live, but that's for homestead properties only. Renters live in non-homestead properties, so arguably they are going to be paying an income tax plus part of that non-homestead property tax in their rent. We're giving some renters, very low income renters, a rebate. But the thought is we should give some, or maybe we shouldn't, but that we have traditionally thought that for at least some groups of people, we should return part of their rent that, for whatever formula we come up with, is supposed to cover what they paid in property tax in that rent. Otherwise, they're double paying. So that's what.
Sorry, that makes some sense to me that you wouldn't want to double charge the renters, so you're trying to give them back some of the non-homestead property tax
Right.
that they are paying through their rent.
If we go through this new system, yes, because there won't be any homestead, I don't think. I think we've dropped that consideration.
But I do think that it's entirely impossible to figure out what portion of a non-homestead a renter is paying. And so it would make more sense to exempt them or rebate them for the income tax. And I guess it just seems to me like we could probably require all renters to fill out the form, the renter rebate, renter credit form, and then some renters would get their income education tax refunded and some would also get the renter rebate. Or sorry, renter credit. And so some folks, you know.
Which is assistance.
Which is assistance essentially. Would that make sense to you if it was just became sort of a broader base that's filling out the form and it would check eligibility for two different things? Or does it make sense to just have, I don't know.
2 sheets. You don't have to give us an answer right now. We'll give you 20 minutes to think about it. But that's, I think, the question we're struggling with at this point in time.
The way I thought it would be done would be on the income tax form. It'd be like a line.
Could be.
Yeah.
On the income tax form. Instead of having all renters fill out the form, there would be a line on the income tax form. So how much did you pay in rent?
That number would be on the W-2 that they get from their employer. And then they just, That's what I was trying, how do we do that? I mean, if every renter has to fill out a renter credit form,
They
I
won't.
would imagine that that's going to require some staffing over at tax department to process all those.
That would be a major increase.
Yeah.
And the idea of doing this was to stop you from having to spend so much time and money processing the other forms. So we ideally want something that'll just shoot through your computer scanner reader and shoot the right answer out on the other side, and not require human beings to sit down and go over.
I mean, income tax refunds are pretty straightforward. Unless they don't file income taxes, but as long as they file taxes, it's just adding a few lines on the form. So that part is easy, easy-ish. Nothing is easy in our world, but relatively easy.
Just be a line after Vermont EGI and it would just,
Still be verified through a landlord certification though.
I mean, nothing else is verified.
Yeah, it's an attestation.
Okay.
That was what I was gonna ask.
Well, yeah, all the landlords are already sending in it.
You're checking a box if you're a homestead or a renter. And if you're a renter, you get a certain refund. But what if you are both? Like, what if you homestead part of the year, rent part of the year?
Yeah, some
And
of
then,
that.
we would sort of have to verify that they actually were a renter.
Yeah, because many people buy a house. So they've been a renter for 3 months, 6 months, and a homeowner for 3 months, 6 months.
Yeah, but we already prorate that.
Yeah,
Some of it, but it does seem to me that you would charge people the income tax and then say, if you're a renter, how much are you paying for rent? And then we assume sort of 20% is some assumption. And then that amount gets credited against what we would have otherwise charged them through the income tax. I mean, the certainly the complexity, most renters are going to be filing income tax, probably, right? Because they're going to be earning income.
Does the landlord form say the rent, or are they just saying, here's the name of my tenants, and that's all they put on there? Do you know what that form says?
Yeah, it's just name of tenant, months rented, subsidized, yes or no? And if they are subsidized, what's the allocable rent?
Not the amount of rent that they pay.
No, that's what changed. It used to be with the renter rebate, the landlord had to go through and say like, yeah, you give $16,000 a year, but 4,000 of that is heating and hot water or whatever. And they give that form to the renter, and then the renter submits it. So
Okay, so we're keeping the landlord from having some might, but go through and say, okay, but this is the portion, figure out the portion of the rent that would be charged to property tax, because I charge you $100 a month, but of that $100 a month, 20's going to pay the heat, because I haven't figured out how to put 5 heaters in here. And 10 is going to the water bill. And so when it comes down to it, only $50 a month is going
right,
to rent, going to property tax.
So the assumption about how much goes to property tax was 21%. 21% of the contract, the net rent after all that stuff is taken out. You take that's the assumption about what goes to property tax. And then it had the brackets like the circuit breaker, and the difference is what the rebate used to be until last year.
We're undoing
That's
that.
that 21%, you know where who came up with that? Like, that's just the way it was. We assumed it was 21% was
For property.
Probably done before Act 60.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
But that's not how it's set up anymore.
No.
So we don't.
We don't
But
have,
it's not a bad, I mean, we're never going to be able to have a simple formula that lets every renter figure out the precise amount that they've already paid, right? So we're going to have to make some assumptions. So that's not a bad starting point.
I think to make it simple, it'd just be on the income form, and the question would be, what does it say you paid in EIT in this box on your W-2? Did you pay rent for 12 months in Vermont? If the answer is yes, you get it back. If the answer is no, then you don't.
do you get it all back?
I think so.
All your rent?
No, all your EIT,
all your
EIT that you
EIT.
paid in. Not your rent, your EIT.
It does open it up though to,
Yeah.
I guess everything, if there's available to do shenanigans, but.
Right,
if you're
right.
charging, if you get your kid living at home and your kid makes $70,000 a year, it all of a sudden becomes advantageous to charge them rent so that they don't have to pay the EIT. I realize that it becomes your income, but it may be such that it doesn't affect much.
See, this is when I miss Senator McDonald, because he can always figure out the way the system can be gamed.
Well, you would want to be careful that I didn't sell my house to my LLC so that I could be a renter, right? Like that's.
Uh-huh.
Have that. So, but then I'm paying the non-homestead.
Homestead rate.
Right.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people do not, do not commit fraud purposely.
Well, that's not fraud. That's just.
Or like the vast majority, sure, but the vast majority of people don't.
No, that's why we're never going to get as much as we think out of upper income
Even
people.
now operating part of your house is.
Can you just design a system so I can suck some money out of my kids?
So kind of,
Seems like we're losing our thread.
Yeah, I think, well, we have been at this a long time, and we have had an awful lot of data thrown at us. I think you know what we're struggling with, and we're trying to find a way, given all the complexities. And I think the reason we went to the present system is because the landlords are saying, yeah, make me, because I'd have to spend, 3 days sitting down here if I got a bunch of apartments figuring out, the water and the heat and my property and what portion that is of their bill. And they're all different rates, and some of them are subsidized. And so we probably aren't going to get all that information. So how do we figure out a simple way? One would just be you get X number of dollars back. And maybe we could base it on the average property tax bill for apartment buildings or something, but you get a flat rebate. You get, because trying to do exactly everybody's, you're paying an income tax and excusing your rent.
But it would be some,
They're different.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's kind of what I took away from this, that this is an income subsidy program for low-income folks for housing, like to keep them in housing, basically. And it's really not applicable to what we're talking.
No, that one isn't.
Or even like, we wouldn't want to even try to bolt something onto this for this, like,
But I don't think we want to do away with this
oh,
either.
no, I don't have any.
The
Yeah,
question is, how simple do we make it for renters to get back their EIT?
and for landlords. If the landlords,
Those landlords aren't involved in this.
Well,
that's right.
I gotta say, the problem with the elegance of refunding their EIT is that it removes a big argument that we've been trying to make, which is renters should have skin in the game.
Well, that's true.
So I've at least conceptually preferred the idea of charging them that, not giving them withholding, because recognizing they're probably gonna get zeroed out. But that shows up on their April reconciliation. And then you give them a credit for the 21% of their rent that is effectively, we presume, gone through the non-homestead rate. And that way you would at least, most people, I mean,
Yeah.
we could run some numbers, but at least then you're a voter, you're going there, you've got the same kind of relationship with the outcome that a homeowner has.
There's
I
some logic
appreciate
there.
that
Yeah.
mixing, the elegance of
And-
that solution, yes.
Maybe we can run
Don't
down
think
where the
that.
21% came from.
No, you're exempting people from withholding, like you
Right.
said, and then you're building in
Yeah.
a percentage refund into that tax.
Yeah.
I wonder if before we wrap, we could, I'm going off script here.
Okay,
We only have a couple meetings left. And so when when we're done with Jake, which I think we are, I'm not sure, want everyone to agree on that. We could just spend a minute talking about the things left in our charge that we have not yet discussed. So we know them. Look at,
and Jake,
Jump the
think
chair.
about this, and if you come back with, I think right now you're going to get 21% of your tax or of your rent exempt
From your tax.
from your education
Assume-
income tax.
Assume that you've already contributed
Right.
that amount.
So we're going to rebate it. But if you can refine that 21, which seems to be a folk legend, I don't know if it was before or after Act 60, but just see if there is a number out there that's,
You want to find out what percentage of rent is attributable to the non-homestead.
Yeah.
That's what you're trying to.
That 20 to be like the pupil weighting where we could, who came up with them or what, how they came up. with them.
it might just be an urban legend. I mean, just if we can tie it down a little tighter.
If, suppose somebody lives in a unit worth $100,000, the non-homestead rate is $1.60. So
$1,600.
$1,600 of non-homestead education property tax being paid on that unit. So if their rent is, let's make it easy, 16,000, then it's 10%. But if their rent is, lower.
1,000 a month. It's, yeah. It's higher.
Then it would be 16% if it's $1,000. No,
I mean,
it's
just,
less than
you
that.
can't make it simple and precise, right? That's,
The one thing that is really, I think, attractive about that is that it takes off the table the people that only rented for a few months or only rented in Vermont for a few months. Because all we want to know is how much have you paid in rent?
that's interesting, yeah.
So
Yeah,
it helps with that conversation a lot.
I think one thing that, people at back tax would get mad at me about is, it takes quite a bit of work to change these things. Like this rent a credit reform took, year planning and a lot of growing pains. So when these things change, it's a strain on the department. So
Tell us that. I don't think we're, want to end up delaying everyone getting their tax returns this year because you guys are doing these things for us. People will get angry.
Or we could also give you any additional capacity that you may need to do things.
Try.
We could try. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Do we want to take like do you want to stretch or do you want to?
Do we have a witness?
No, I just want to hear from Abby about what we have left in our charge. Not to talk about what we have left, just to so we can all leave knowing what we have.
We haven't done. Okay,
done.
you're not looking
I
at
have
us.
no interest in a conversation.
Okay,
At all.
no
I'm
interest in
done
a
talking to everyone for the day. I like you all
Okay.
very much.
That
but,
just made things much easier.
I just want Abby to tell us some things and we will not speak and just listen. Thank you for asking.
I don't know if I need to say for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel, just to remind you of your duties under the enabling legislation. The first is either restructuring the renter credit or creating a new credit, or other mechanisms to ensure Vermonters who rent a primary residence participate fairly in the education income tax system, if there were to be a new one.
Assuming that they don't now, or?
No, assuming we're making a change.
Assuming there's non-homestead and an education income tax. So that gives you some leeway there. And what that mechanism would be, if it were withholding, how that would be structured, or if it were a credit, those are your credit against
Okay,
income
we
tax.
started that conversation.
The other big sort of lift that I don't think has had much discussion is the transition from the current system to a potential new system. Say that with a bit of a question mark there, because that could take some time. And how you'd want to move from one to the
Cash
next.
flow.
Yes, so I have cash flow, actually, that's not really one of your charges, but I know that's been something that you've discussed wanting to address. But I mean, it could fall under that transition, because how are you paying schools, how are schools, who's collecting, all of the administrative side impacts cash flow. The third is accurate modeling, which I think you've had a lot of discussion about, and JFO has been working hard on that, as well as revenue taxes. The fourth did come up today, whether there should be a limit to the amount of income subject to any potential new income tax. That is probably one of the easiest, sort of most straightforward questions for you to consider. There are some catch-alls of just any challenges or considerations for administering this, so that gets into the cash flow as well. And then you did hear from Sarah at JFO about the impact on the general fund, so tax incapacity. Those are within the enabling legislation. There is also within your charge, you do have to have proposed legislative language. So once I have not begun that, waiting to hear what direction the committee wants to go in. So that could be as detailed or as broad as you would like.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Short form, Bill.
Do it.
2 sections, yeah.
But what if we can't reach a conclusion or don't think this is a good idea? I mean, it's unusual for a charge to tell us we have to write legislation when we're supposed to be studying
I feel very comfortable with this idea, and maybe too comfortable, I don't know, with this idea of we're figuring out how we would do it if we were going to do it. This would be the bill if we were to do it, and being clear in the report that we're not sure if we should do it or not, but if we were to, this would be the bill and this would be,
Take a position.
none of us have to sponsor it.
Right.
Abby could just spend her time drafting it and then it never goes anywhere.
Someone will sponsor it. It'll be good.
You want equal time. Yeah, I think that because The only outside group we've heard from has been public assets. We haven't heard from the schools.
Yes, we did. We heard from all of them at the beginning. First meeting.
Well,
But
yeah.
we should circle back.
But yes, we should circle back. We have not heard from the Appropriations Committee representatives or the,
I mean, that's the legislature.
yes, but this is going to have to go, this will go through the committee process and those things will
Yeah.
come up once there's something
Well, I guess.
in writing to react
We'll
to.
hear from them before we wrap in this.
We can send it out.
I would be perfectly comfortable saying, this is how you do it. But there are a lot of policy discussions and
That need-
that need to happen down.
And I think our report should flag the big ones. You know,
Yeah.
Okay,
We reached a decision for.
General fund implications being top of the list. Yeah.
okay.
We did our work. Now you do your work.
So, Abby, I'm thinking of the next agenda planning. Do you have enough here? I think we're going with option 2, right? To draft something?
I could start. I will have many questions.
Okay,
And then maybe bringing us those questions at our meeting.
yes.
A lot of horizontal lines.
Given some of the direction,
And one of the questions,
rates and really specific numbers can wait.
yeah,
I do have a lot of questions about how you would be dealing with renters. That's sort of the biggest.
renters, I think, will be section next to the last.
Can we look at what it means to not have it be only residents, but instead income tax filers?
Well, let's put that on the agenda for next time. Do you have enough data to crank that out?
I would have to ask Graham.
Look, he appeared. I didn't even know he was
He
logged
is
in.
so good at, it's like a genie in a bottle.
That's what people call me.
Yes.
I wanted to raise that issue for the committee. If the committee goes with option 2, then we would need further guidance about how to do that, because the way that the personal income tax is, the way we've modeled this is that based upon the town that you live in, you would your rate would be adjusted by a certain amount. And so when someone files their personal income tax return, they put in what their school code is, or basically where they live.
Right.
But for a non-resident, they're putting 0. And so the question is, what ratio would we apply to non-residents? Just the average, or something above average, or?
The average. I mean, the whole thing is hinged on whether you sit above or below the average for the adjustment. So,
I vote for average.
Just like a Vermonter that owns a non-homestead property.
Yeah.
Yeah, they pay with average.
Yeah.
Okie dokie, thanks.
Okay.
oh, that was.
All
easy.
problems.
Usually the genie helps us.
Yeah,
And it's our.
but we aren't going to be able to find the genie.
Scary.
Okay. So next time we will schedule to do a discussion of that. And Jake, if you have any thoughts on how we might deal with renters, we'll put you on, unless you'd rather not. But, just some more thought about renters. And then I think, Abby, you can start drafting based on option 2. With the thought that there will be a renter rebate. It sounds like right now it's going to be a % of the rent you pay. But
Percent of the tax you pay.
The rent pay.
the rent, it's a % of your rent is the credit towards your tax. Because a % of the rent, and we're going to see if we can refine the 21% urban legend reality. And then, that's the renter rebate. And then non-residents still up in the air.
I will include lots of placeholders as ways to direct some of the committee discussion.
Thank you.
Seems like another big thing that we have to figure out is where that money would come from, right?
Which money?
The money we're rebating.
That's right.
Indeed.
So that's,
I don't think
that,
there's only one option, right? It's the ed fund.
Is the proper, yeah.
Well, but do you go after the non-residential income tax rate?
Let's not use the phrase go after.
Is that-
Yeah.
and then what about the further delineating properties? Like, is that a way?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's an issue. That's something we can just flag as,
It'd be great to have a whatever bare bones understanding of what that could do to the numbers.
Yeah, because it seems like it would be good to talk about that. So if we have these two in the meetings, if we have time, it's like what different options are there?
okay,
And
so
how much
if
is
we differentiate non-homestead property, and I've heard business, rental, and
Second home.
second homes. And I think unless you want the guys in orange vests down here, that we are probably going to have to say seasonal. Some of you maybe have missed all that fun. But seasonal, I don't want to get caught in the deer camp with the
Yeah,
outhouse.
no, they're different from second homes. That should be separate. Yeah.
But, well,
It's hard to leave.
they're non-residential.
Weatherized or not weatherized.
They're non-homestead residential properties. So we are going to have to,
They're already different on the grand list.
yeah, just make sure that,
Right, I guess seasonal.
yeah, that's,
Nice.
Because there's $500,000 seasonal places on Lake Champlain.
yes, there are seasonal places on Lake Champlain, some very nice ones.
How about, we've talked about withholding, but then does the adjustment get done on your April filing? Because employers, okay, that's what I assumed about it.
That's when EIT's
And
report.
we haven't gotten anything with withholding.
But Emily, earlier you said exempt from holding.
I thought we were talking about that renters can exempt themselves from withholding, the same way you might do a different, whatever those numbers are on your,
Exempting the 21% that they would be
No, they
getting.
would be with,
they could entirely exempt
I would
themselves.
assume that their 21% is gonna cover their income.
They're exempt from withholding, but not exempting from the tax.
Right.
Yes,
So they chew it up in April.
yes, and likely,
Want to do withholding, you get a big return.
Maybe we should ask Jake if the tax department can set up withholding for income tax, an income tax, we've got a bracketed rate, but that bracketed rate will be adjusted up and down by local school spending, whether it's above or below the statewide average. And then we get to the question of, do you use the budgets that are voted in March? And I think we decided, since some people pay their income tax in January, that we'd have to go back to the previous year. Am I remembering that
Yeah.
correctly, even though we'd like a more, but can you withhold?
They already are.
They're withholding your income, but it's based on your income. This, we're asking them to withhold a 2.25% income surcharge, but it will vary by town.
Right.
So that's why I was asking. I'm assuming it would be a standard withhold.
yes.
A standard withhold 2% and then you get it rebated. They'll give you something to think about, Jake.
The tough,
We believe in sharing the misery in this committee.
the tough one's gonna be the first year where you're gonna be like, okay, we passed this thing hypothetically. These rates kick in July and you pay 6 months and then you didn't pay 12 months of withholding.
Right.
And so then you've either gotta pay a chunk at filing, or maybe you do something the first 6 months, you do a double withholding, or, I mean, that's the.
Yeah, that transition is
We can-
real.
Yeah.
Let's all spend some transition thinking time.
Yeah. But I mean, that is at least solvable with the policy.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing is we're only talking about whatever percent it is of the whole ed fund. So there's some ability to shift some of the cash flow based on on the non-homestead and the sales tax. It's not like we're zeroing it out and starting again, right? So.
Right, it's just that, it's just how do you line that withholding up in that first year? Yeah.
Yeah, and, you know, for transition, some people are gonna pay less, some people are gonna pay more, but the total amount we're collecting will remain the same.
Yeah, but, you know, to the, Emily's point, you know, is there a way within the withholding to like not collect it from renters? You know, because sometimes their cash flow, it's difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, I know with unemployment, if you're a business, you know, you calculate, you know, you tell them what their wages are and it calculates. And at some point, and it's done, I mean, automatically through the department. Once that employee hits, I think it's $10,000 of wages, they don't apply any taxes after that point. It's only on the first 10,000, I believe. So I mean, that type of, you know, that type of stuff exists.
There are a lot of mechanisms like that.
Yeah, there are things that I think you could.
But with, yeah,
Check a box, this person's.
really low income people,
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're already making decisions about your withholding when you get your job. So on that form or whatever, they're.
Yeah, you can really like you can really withhold way less or way more depending on decisions that individuals make on that form.
Like if you're eligible for the renter credit, you don't have to do that.
Yeah, it would be like a check, yeah.
Yeah.
Don't withhold. Yeah.
okay. Anything else we need to cover? So I get really nervous when Abby is looking puzzled and Jake is looking puzzled. You look relaxed, so that's good. I don't want to give, you know, staff.
I think everyone will look more puzzled the longer we stay here.
Yes, that is true. We
Okay.
keep coming up with stuff. So I think we've given everybody enough. We will meet Tuesday, right? Agenda planning, just the two of us meet with staff and they tell us what we did to them now that they've had time to think about it. And Jake, if you want to be part of that agenda planning too, you know, communicate to us either in person or through Abby or, you know, just let us know any thoughts you come up with.
On anything.
Yeah,
Jake.
on anything, Jake, but the renter question, the withholding question,
Freestyling has always been dangerous for me. If there's questions that I can prepare for, then I would be happy to help.
okay, well, I think the first one is, and I think it's the simplest, if we can agree on a percentage,
Okay.
can we just rebate a percentage of their rent to a renter? The second one, which I'm losing right now, is can we withhold? Can your computers withhold without having to hire 20 new staff? An income tax, something like in education income tax, will be a surcharge. When that tax is going to vary by the spending in a town, it's not going to be one set tax rate. It will vary by town. And is that something the tax department can do?
We release withholding tables. I just did that for 2023, but the actual withholding is done by employers. And they often have software, maybe QuickBooks or other software that does it for them. So I think what you're thinking would be, can the tax department release some tables to guide how they do that to account for different town level income tax?
We don't need to do withholding at the town level.
No, but the employer, why not?
I mean, it's.
The tax rate you withholding is different.
We're just withholding the average and then it would be reconciled at the state level at the time of filing by town. There's no need to withhold.
Okay.
Difference town by town.
So we'll do a standard withholding?
Nightmare, yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be
Yeah.
crazy.
No,
All right.
no.
So can you do, that's gotta make life a lot easier.
And-
Can you do an add-on 2%?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
then that solves that problem. All right.
Thank you.
It gets more complicated if it only applies to certain groups. Because then the employer would like need to say, you know, are you a renter? And they have to periodically ask that.
No,
Yeah.
But if it applies to everybody, you know, then, yeah.
yeah, okay. And then we'll deal with giving it back to the renters as a,
It applies to
But they might have,
all the homes.
Doesn't- is it-
And then get it back.
All the renters get it back.
It applies to all the renters, but not all income tax stuff.
right.
I don't know if I disagree with it or not. all I'm thinking is that if everybody gets the same withholding, you know, does that weaken the connection between the voter's decision and what they think they're voting for?
I don't think so, but I think we can continue that conversation another day.
Yeah, it's 4:00. And it's been a long, some of us have had a long 2 days.
Jake, is it fair, withholding is like a strategy, right? I mean, I can tell my employer, no, I'm gonna deal with my taxes in April.
Yes.
So it's,
Yeah, it's a mechanism that helps people pay their taxes and be
Claim
guidance
and
that
it's-
most people end
have
up
no
paying
taxes.
fund.
I always, if you sit down and figure out how much interest you pay on your credit card, but you don't notice it, you don't notice your federal income tax because it's all withheld. And so you never, it's the having to sit down and write a check for a couple $1,000s that makes it property tax stand out. It's not it's because it's done in 1 or 2 or 3 lump sums that are large,
Estimated payers, of course, will feel it.
so.